Peter, thank you so much. Just tell us very quickly, why was this report commissioned, and what is this report going to enable the World Economic Forum on Africa to do?
Well, first, it's a product of the World Economic Forum, not the World Economic Forum Africa per se. So it's the global body, the mothership, as it were. They have a number of global agenda councils. This is the Global Agenda Council on Trade. And obviously the forum, being a forum of big business primarily, not exclusively, it's very interested in the world of trade. So what it's doing with this report is feeding it into its various discussions. So it goes into the Davos framework, for instance. A draft version of it was tabled at the recent G20 trade ministers meeting.
Yeah.
And there it was discussed fairly extensively. So it's those kinds of forums that the forum is looking to plug it into, and ultimately the intention is to input into the global debate on trade and trade policy.
Okay. Now, Peter, just a little background. You were at the Department of Trade and Industry when Minister Alec Erwin was still the minister under former President Thabo Mbeki. If you peruse the kind of approach to trade and industry now, would you say there is a departure? We spoke earlier about the focus on industrial policy, if you like. Is there a departure, and does the South African approach to trade and industry take into account these changing realities in terms of this value chain that you're talking about? Does it actually account or take into account these changes?
On the first question, I would say there is a shift. It's a shift of emphasis. Under Alec Erwin, there was quite a lot of discussion about liberalisation.
Yes.
In the WTO particularly, but also the EU trade agreement was negotiated and concluded, and the SADC free trade agreement as well. Since then, there's been very little liberalisation, and the emphasis has shifted back towards protection and what is called industrial policy. And within that industrial policy space, I think there is quite a deep-seated skepticism about the role of multinational companies particularly.
But your report speaks specifically to the reality of multinational companies,
Exactly.
and of course also their role in that product process rather than an individual product. So where does the role of governments come in, given the fact that there's great appetite, not just in South Africa but on the continent, for a very decided role for the state?
Well, I think that's precisely the point. So the question I'm interested in is, can South Africa and the region more generally attract the kind of value chain investments that China, East Asia more generally has been able to attract, and which have been very successful for those countries in terms of lifting them out of poverty, growing exports, employing large numbers of people. And in the report, we don't look at that specifically because we're more interested in the world of global value chains generally. We don't try to apply to any particular country. My own view is that I'm quite skeptical. I think the current policy stance does not lend itself towards this kind of approach for a whole range of reasons, which we touched on in the previous segment. But by and large, if you want to attract multinational corporations in, then you have to provide an environment that they find favorable. And I think there are a number of signals that are pushing in opposite directions. I think, for instance, of the Walmart case, which I think is pushing in the direction of screening investments. Certainly we've seen those noises coming out of Parliament. Multinational companies watch this and say, well, I'm not sure I want to invest in a country that's going to impose all sorts of conditions on me, where I'm not sure what the conditions will be tomorrow. I'm not sure if the mines, for instance, will be nationalized. All of these questions are not particularly conducive to attracting multinational corporation investment. So the investment environment is fundamental to this perspective.
But if we're looking at developed countries, they're not throwing protectionism out of the window completely. Why should developing countries be doing so?
No, absolutely. And in fact, if you look at the G20 countries, the group of countries that constituted, and at the various reports that look at global trends in protectionism, the EU, the US, Japan, China even, these countries are all employing various forms of protection. That's a political response. It doesn't necessarily mean it's the correct economic response. And you would find very few economists who think that that's a good idea, I suspect. Now, a country like South Africa, I mean, there's a prior question as to whether manufacturing can really be the key driver of job creation in South Africa. I don't think it can, actually. I think the jobs are far more likely to come from elsewhere. and probably from places that we cannot predict. So the idea of picking winners, I think, is quite misplaced in a way. Therefore, what the state should do is provide the right environment, and that doesn't mean the state must get out of the economy, no. If you think about providing things like a decent education system, that requires a strong role for the state and for the state to play its role effectively. And I think the problem we have at the moment is that on many levels the state is not playing its role effectively.
If one were to talk about an ideal mix, Peter, in terms of a role for the state, not just in South Africa, but in Africa as a whole. And we know infrastructure is a key, aspect of any kind of ensuring that Africa is viable as an investment destination. What is the ideal marriage between what the state should be doing and what big business should be doing? And how does that inform policy making? I mean, can you have a completely liberalized environment? Obviously not. You can't have a closed protectionist environment. What is the right mix?
Again, there's no simple answer to that question. I think it's really context dependent. So you asked
Let's take Africa. Let's start with Southern Africa and Africa as a whole. Yeah.
Okay. Look, in South Africa, clearly our institutions are much more robust than pretty much most other African countries. But Botswana is not the same as Zimbabwe. So just to make the point that it really is context dependent. But by and large, I think where you have weak states, which is typically the African scenario, it probably doesn't make that all that much sense to go for heavy-handed state intervention, because you're going to create problems for yourself. So, but at the same time, you don't want to allow multinational corporations free rein, because the private sector does need to be regulated. If the global financial crisis has taught us one thing, it's that.
Indeed.
So, yeah.
Just in terms of your recommendations of the report, in relation to existing preferential trade agreements. I'm talking now specifically, say, SA-EU relations, also SADC versus COMESA, and so on. How do these changing realities in the global chain, value chain, how does it impact those preferential trade agreements, particularly if one is now disputing concepts like, what is this, place of origin from goods. So how exactly do you take this kind of dynamic thing that's happening in the global value chain and build it into trade agreements that is essentially there to protect the interests of countries?
To generalize hugely, again, it's about reducing transactions costs. So you have to make.
Give me a practical example. How do we let's take mining, for example. How do we do that?
Mining may not be the best example, but let's use manufacturing.
Oh, manufacturing, yes.
So if you want to be able to move goods freely around the region, firstly you need to get rid of tariffs within your free trade arrangement. That typically does happen. Then the rules of origin, in other words, determining whether goods originate from within the region, need to be liberal, effectively. You need to allow goods to come into the region to add value and then to be either exported or exported within the region. So that means you don't want regulatory barriers to get in the way. You also need things like very efficient customs processes, one-stop border posts. You need to provide all the right infrastructure. All of these things are typically part of a trade negotiating process.
Quickly, a perusal of the existing regulatory framework. Can we do this? And are we in a position to get that mind shift that is required to allow for rules of engagement to actually keep track with what is actually happening in the world of trade?
In South Africa? Well, I think the rules and regulations across a range of fronts are constantly being re-evaluated through various policy processes, but what is lacking is a systematic focus using this kind of value chain concept. Or the current discourse in many ways is going in the opposite direction. It's about reintroducing protection, which we would argue is not a good thing. And so if your framework is to reintroduce protection and for the state to pick winners, it's going to take you in a different direction to what we're suggesting here, and your resulting regulatory outcomes would be very different to what we are suggesting here.
And if one takes a place like Nigeria, what does the prospects look like there?
In terms of plugging into global value chains? Well, Well, Nigeria is a chaotic country. So notwithstanding all the projections about Nigerian GDP exceeding South African in a year or two, who knows? It
Of course,
will.
Nigeria comes off a much lower base, so some of those projections might
Sure.
be exaggerated.
That's true, but I think fairly soon Nigeria's GDP will outstrip South Africa's. But what does it mean once you dig below the surface? Because what we're arguing is actually you need a good governance environment as well to promote the investment, the right investment climate. Because what these companies want is to be able to import goods and export having added value to them. It requires a stable regulatory environment, and I don't think Nigeria could be characterized as such. So they've got a window in which to get that right, as have the rest of us. The question is whether we'll take advantage of it.